the National Cattlemen's Beef Association is kind of fascinating in its own right, because here it is an organization that is supposed to be advocating for the rancher, for the cattle producers. And Mike, I'm going to ask you, I mean, if you're supporting American cattle, the NCBA has actually advocated for importing cattle. Doesn't that directly go against the interests of American ranchers?
Absolutely. I remember, Dave, when was it, 2002, when the Canadians had the DSE problem? Mm-hmm. And those imports were just totally shut off in a matter of days. And we saw a significant increase in the cattle market for U.S. producers. RCAF was formed about that time, and it was all about addressing unfair imports. And those imports were used to leverage the U.S. cattle market lower. NCBA opposed that entire effort. NCBA is one of those organizations that support this globalization stuff, you know, that Winona was talking about earlier. And so they act absolutely contrary to the interest of U.S. cattle producers.
And there's, for those of you with economics, there's something called elasticity. Whenever you get 1% of imported beef, it lowers the price paid to ranchers about 2%. But you don't really need to control 100% of the market, just enough that keeps the prices depressed. And so the NCBA, an advocacy organization, is in fact working against it. Dave, let me ask you this. The NCBA, which should support free markets, they actually said we support consolidation of the grocery industry, like Winona was saying it was destroying it. The NCBA came out in favor of that, correct?
Well, I don't know about that particularly, but I can tell you that a couple of years ago they had a demonstration on how to vertically integrate, which is basically what you're saying. We're going to vertically integrate, and they wanted producers to get in line with genetics so that the calves were sold before they were even born. So that therefore it becomes an integrated line to where, like you're saying, somebody's going to control the finished product and no one else gets a shot at it.
That was the long-range plan that was implemented when the merger occurred and became NCBA. The long-range plan was to really design the cattle and beef industries around the poultry industry that had become already vertically integrated, enslaving those producers and producing a product through a completely industrialized and factory-like food system.
Well, as a matter of fact, you remember that tape you had with Bob Peterson where you were asking him, where are those shipments coming down into Dakota City?
Right. Well, the question was asked at the Governor's Conference in South Dakota in 1996 to Bob Peterson, who was on a panel with myself. They said, what about all those Canadian imports? And Bob Peterson said, we don't import. Johnny Smith went to the mic, auction market operator from Pierre, South Dakota. He said, well, Mr. Peterson, what are all those semis coming down I-29 to the Dakota City plant? Those are Canadian cattle. Johnny said, aren't those imports? We don't import. And I said, Bob, those are imports. And he blew up, called me a bald-faced liar,
Yep.
said the GD word in front of 1,000 people, said all kinds of horrible things, and basically said those aren't imports because we owned the cattle before they crossed the Canadian border.
Yep. That's outsourcing.
That's outsourcing.
We call it that's
Exactly.
outsourcing.
Well, we can see all these transgressions which are occurring against the rancher for a ranching advocacy organization. Now, I know that one of the restrictions with the beef checkoff is that it's not allowed to be used for lobbying, for influencing people at the Department of Agriculture and our representatives. Mike, can either you or Dave say how they are using all of their checkoff dollars to skirt this?
I'd like to pass on to Mike because he has a very interesting point about your brand. Your brand is
Yeah, you mean when
because of those checkoff dollars.
Yeah, well, NCBA represents policy that supports industrial agriculture. It represents the interests of big meat packers and big food. And so, 14 years ago, I started Ranch Foods Direct, came to Colorado Springs, called the Colorado Beef Council up and said, hey, what dollars are available for us to promote local brands, local initiatives to support beef? And basically they said, none. Our dollars go to national companies where we think they're more effective. And so that was a really early indication for me that this thing is completely wrong. And for every animal that I bring to Colorado Springs to sell through our infrastructure called Ranch Foods Direct, every single one of those animals I pay the beef checkoff on. My money is going to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association to put me out of business because they support the predators in the marketplace, which are the JBS, Tyson, Cargill, national beef companies. This is amazing.
But you had talked about, before we talked about you talked about how it has allowed NCDA to build their brand.
Absolutely.
That's how
Well,
they get it.
absolutely. And in fact, that's one of the things. NCBA is a policy organization.
Yep.
They are funded by the national beef checkoff dollars. They have gone, and by the way, some of their major promotion dollars are spent in cattlemen publications. And so they are actually out there brainwashing the producer to be happy about paying the checkoff. So it doesn't build beef demand. It mentally conditions the opponent, perhaps, the producer, when he figures it out, to not support it. And so all the while, they are building their own brand in Washington as the representative for cattle producers, when in fact the opposite is true. And so they carry a very big stick in Washington, D.C.
And that's how I would say the lobbying, the money winds up being used as lobbying, because to actually say that, yeah, checkoff dollars are spent as lobbying, that's almost impossible to prove. But Mike's point is absolutely correct.
Well, some of the members of the NCBA are like pharmaceutical companies that supply the antibiotics to the veterinarians and to the industrial meat processors. I think Monsanto might be a member of it. These big corporations. Dave, you mentioned that they were not allowed to have annual meetings anymore unless one of these insiders were in attendance of this. Is that my understanding of this? The policy meetings?
No.
Okay, I apologize for misunderstanding, but
Tim, that makes me think of a good point. So the National Cattlemen's Beef Association in 1996, when they merged with the Beef Checkoff, so it was National Cattlemen's Association merged with Beef Checkoff to become the NCBA. I was there in San Antonio that year opposing that merger. But what they also did was they opened up their board to meat packers, to industry. So they have the industry folks that now are at the table, and they pay money to be at that table. And many of them are the pharmaceutical companies who sell the implants, the performance-enhancing drugs, the Zilmax. And these are companies who have depended upon NCBA and their power in Washington to really keep the doors open so that they can keep the antibiotics in their model, which is dependent upon it. And if the NCBA had any consideration whatsoever about beef quality, consumer demand, and what is good for cattle producers, how in fact could they promote the use of pink slime? That killed beef production in this country for a while, and now it is fully back. It is fully back into the marketplace. Very quietly snuck its way back into the marketplace. Consumers don't even realize it happened. Zilmax has been approved after being found to be inhumane on the animals and decreasing beef quality. It just basically repulsive in every way you can imagine. It has now been approved back into the Korean market, the South Korean market, with NCBA sitting there beating them up, threatening trade lawsuits, and basically just bullying the use of the Zilmax back into the marketplace.
Now, the lean, fine, textured beef Let's be correct here.
Yeah, yeah,
Having fun with Mike.
LFTB,
Yeah, it snuck in previously and it snuck in again.
right.
You weren't told about it the first time and you weren't told about it the second.
And this is product that was going to very good use. Who was it Paul Maggie was talking about, his pets? I mean, cats and dogs were eating this stuff. It was good for them. And Chris, it was you. I mean, it was going to very good use. It had good value. But what is the point of turning pet food into people food? And hiding it and not having to label that product in the market?
And that's the key point, label. Because NCBA is, I'm sorry, Tim.
No, that's important because this is something else, the NCBA, that it's called country of origin labeling. Cool. And there is a pride in American ranching and quality of American beef, but the NCBA perhaps has a different take on it. Dave, you want to explain?
I would like to point out that the checkoff spends money on exports, and quite a bit of money to export our product into another foreign country. And I've watched the videos where they have lines of housewives from Taiwan or Hong Kong or Japan, Tokyo, to buy U.S. product. USMEF, the United States Meat Export Federation, has pointed out that our export market has added like $250 per head to our finished cattle. Now, I guarantee you that consumer is not buying just beef over in that foreign country. They're buying U.S. beef. So, it's really simple. Information is money. Whether you hold the information or whether you release the information, it's money. So, they want everyone to know outside of the border that it's U.S. beef. But inside the border, not so much. We really don't want you to know, because information is money.
For example, Chipotle talks about their farm-to-table program and has Willie Nelson sings the nice songs about back to the start and this farmed and dangerous and how wonderful they are. Beef in Australia, the day that I did the analysis, was 48% of the value of U.S., the cattle that were for sale in Australia. And of course, this is a market dominated and controlled by JBS and Cargill, the same big companies that control our markets here. And so, 48%, and it costs 4 cents a pound to ship the beef from Australia to the U.S. You add to that pink slime, you've got a mighty cheap product to compete against U.S. cattle producers with, and U.S. companies like Ranch Foods Direct with. And so basically what happened is Chipotle got sued by their shareholders for a fiduciary duty problem. They weren't making enough money for those shareholders. In fact, they were paying too much for their ingredients, for the commodities that they were putting in those burritos. And so they ended up dropping the U.S. sources for their products and now are importing these products, and better yet, they're importing them from a company, the same company that got caught in China recycling chicken and picking it up off the floor and putting it in the product. This is now the product. They do not want American consumers to know where their food comes from because they can import it way cheaper than what we can produce it for.
Whether you like it or not, the statistics show that 50% of what Americans consume is ground beef. 50% of the beef consumed is ground beef. We don't produce enough ground beef. So what we do is we export chucks and rounds and import trimmings to meet that demand. And we don't want you to know, or they don't want you to know where it comes from. If you remember back when the 2002 BSE cow, the Christmas cow, the first thing that came out was it's a North American beef industry. Mike Johans, my own senator, who was my governor, who was the Secretary of Agriculture. It's a North American beef industry. They were pushing that. In other words, they were saying, let the science decide, and it's a North American beef industry, so how can you keep your own product from coming in to sell to your own customers? And now I lost my train of thought for a moment on that. Country of origin labeling and bringing the beef in from...
he's talking about bringing in the trim, hamburger.
And trim and hamburger.
Demand in that.
Well, let me ask this question. I think there was a recent study. How many DNA thumbprints, if I can use that term, DNA impressions, did they find in a single McDonald's ground meat hamburger?
In 1998, Colorado State University did a DNA analysis on a quarter-pound burger patty like McDonald's would sell. There were 1,058 distinct different DNA in that product. In other words, there were 1,058 animals represented in that burger patty. So, a couple of years ago, I called CSU, where I graduated in 1975, and I said, can we redo that study? I'd love to know what it is now. We've had a lot of consolidation, a lot of concentration in the industry. We've increased our imports, and we now have pink slime and advanced meat recovery in these products. I want to know how many DNA are in a burger today. We've got 5,000 animals a day going through, 6,000 animals a day going through the Garden City plant, which is pretty representative of the typical big slaughterhouse in the United States. They grind that stuff at the end of the day. A lot of it gets mixed together. This would be valuable information. It would be a key indicator for me. They laughed. They laughed on the telephone.
Seriously.
They aren't going to even think about doing such a study when they are financed. That university is financed by Big Food, by the JDS, who used to be ConAgra. Yes, that used to be the Montfort chair at CSU, and then it became ConAgra, and then Swift, and now it's JBS. There's no way we're going to know that number, and in fact, it would be so unbelievable that people would just say no. I'm not doing this. And so the alternative is to buy food from somebody you know, where there's one cow in that pound of ground beef.
I know where I was going to go with that, the country board. Just this year, Wendy's up in Montana did a beef promotion with checkoff dollars promoting the beef as being North American beef.
Which is Mexico, U.S., and Canada.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
What I'd like to do now is if there's any questions that you might like to ask that pertaining to what's in your beef, about the beef checkoff and independent ranching. This is your best opportunity to do it. And we got a lot of questions coming up over on this side, I see. And
I might just mention, Tim, some of the students from Deb Smith's sociology class are in the room, and they're really worried about social justice.
Is that the famous Bev Smith sociology class that I've heard so much about?
I don't know.
You'll
have to ask.
Okay, we'll have to find out.
This is a social justice problem. This is very
It
unfair.
is. Okay, first question up here, please, Janine. Okay.
So what do you recommend for an independent rancher? First steps.
Well, for starters, the average cow herd is only about 40 head. That's the average. 40 head is the average size. So, and somebody who's got 20, 30, 40 head usually has a job in town. When they sell cattle, it's basically a hobby, or they're keeping the local spot at home, that was dad or grandpa's. So then it becomes hard for that local person to promote just his product, unless you're going to have, like Colorado Springs is putting on, what you're doing with your food market. So the best thing that could happen for that individual and still be viable in the market, in my opinion, is country of origin labeling. Because like me, as myself, we raise 400 head of cows. But even we don't compete with, there's ranchers that got thousands and thousands of cattle. And what happens is, I cannot supply the needs. If I go with 400 head and try to supply the needs of a group of people, it'll be next to impossible. I mean, the feeding system that we have today and the distribution system and the slaughter system we have today has made it so that you can have beef every single day. So what I see is country of origin labeling is the number one most thing that's going to help out most ranchers, because then you as a consumer are going to be able to make a choice, which is what we talked about last night, and which Chris Peterson said today. the consumers are gonna have to start making choices.
And I don't see that smaller independent producer has a lot of choices. If you're a small producer and you can sell your animals through the locker plant and receive back $3,300 a head, which is basically what you're paying at Walmart for the beef that you buy, and that absolutely works well for that producer, that's okay. But when you take a guy like Dave Wright, who's got 800 cows,
400.
or 400
I'd like
cows,
800.
or anybody in the middle, like Bill Heffernan talks about, the people in the middle are screwed because they aren't getting the sweetheart preference deals that are absolutely illegal under the Packers and Stockyards Act. But the big guys have all got sweetheart deals. They are suppliers to the big meat packers, and they're getting more than the quoted market sale prices. And so the guys in the middle are really getting hammered. They just do not have a market. But what they have to do is they have to sell at the point in the marketplace that is most competitive. And right now, that's the sale barn. That's selling a calf, because there is no market for fat cattle. There is no market for finished cattle unless you are one of the players getting the sweetheart deals. You may get a price, but it is not a market. It is not a fair market.
That's correct.
Okay, do we have another question up here?
Yeah, Dave, Mike, thank y'all. I wanted to, you all hit on the advocacy and the fact that NCBA receives $30–40 million a year, and then while they can't prove that they necessarily spend those dollars, which would be illegal, to advocate in the legislature. But I find a lot of times that consumers and others, and you've done a great job of telling why cattlemen ought to care, but how does NCBA use that influence in other ways to prevent other types of legislation? You may want to talk about COOL, GIPSA this past legislative year, or other issues that they lobby against that are consumer driven.
Well, they lobby. I mean, these guys own Washington. And it's amazing. When George Bush, GW, was elected president, his first speech was made at the NCBA convention. They gave him a big white hat. And he became the advocate. They had their own advocate in Washington. It was the President of the United States. This is a mighty powerful lobbying group based totally and funded with our checkoff. And so when country of origin labeling comes up, which is so totally contrary to the big meat packers' interests when they want to bring cheap stuff in, they block it. And Barack Obama was elected president with all the promises that he made to those in agriculture. Chris Peterson could relate that very well. He made a lot of promises, and we were very optimistic that we were going to get some law enforcement around antitrust and country of origin labeling, a ban on big meat packer ownership of livestock, whole list of about 9 things that I thought were really, really important. We got absolutely none of them. And at the same time, NCBA just tried to kill this president's agenda. Totally tried to kill it. And now we have a Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, hired by our president, Barack Obama, and Vilsack, having been opposed with every step by the NCBA, all we're doing is asking him to take their money away. And the question is going to be now, will he do it? Even after they have opposed him every step of the way. So it's so important for us to come together as consumer groups, collaborate, build coalitions to provide enough support behind the president, behind Secretary Vilsack. Secretary Vilsack even said there just wasn't enough support in the country to get those GIPSA rules. There was too much power in Washington opposing them. But what do you expect when only 0.7% of our population is even growing the food anymore? We have to come together as consumers, not just producers, to get a more fair food system.
And I'd like to follow up on that just a little bit more. NCBA was formed in '96. Who was president then?
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton. So they have managed to get on both sides of the aisle, and they work it quite well. OCM did a report a couple years ago about the revolving door. and this was going on when I was on the Nebraska Beef Council, as those employees leave NCDA, they somehow get a job at USDA. Isn't that incredible?
I would like to mention that the last question was asked by Joe Maxwell, who is the Vice President of Outreach, I believe, for the Humane Society of the United States, and he will be a presenter after the lunch break, and you're going to want to hear what HSUS is doing across the country as far as advocacy for animals and rural communities and economics is incredible. Let's get another question going here. Yeah.
Let's go back to this pink slime thing. I made an observation when that blew. Started watching the responses in defense of the pink slime. And of course, it was our land grant institutions. And it was the meats people. It wasn't the economists. It was the meats people in a selected group of institutions from Iowa State all the way to Texas A&M. And one of the comments from someone at Oklahoma State University was, we've got to train the consumer.
I know we have a question up here, and we have a couple down here. Okay. We're going to come to you third, okay?
I don't need a mic, I don't think.
Well,
We're recording it, Reed.
I just had a quick question, Tim.
All right.
You talk about getting people interested in working on this campaign, so to speak. How do you get producers at this point to get involved when we have a record price for calves and for yearlings, et cetera?
Reed, the cattle prices of today are wonderful. We're very, very thankful for these prices ranchers are receiving. I just wish the ranchers were still around to receive them, that were here 35 or 40 years ago. But the price today and the market value of these animals today is a result of market failure. This is not a market today. And it's also a result of shining a very bright light on what an animal is worth at the Walmart meat counter. And how little of that was getting back to that farm and ranch gate. And thanks to Food and Water Watch and many other organizations for helping shine that light. But we've got to make it wrong for these packers to plunder and pillage the way that they've been doing. They talk about their efficiencies, and what a lie. What an unbelievable lie they tell when they promote efficiency. And we can talk about that at another time, perhaps. But this is not a market. This is a price. And we have to, it's a price supported by hell raising. And we've got to keep it up.
okay, let's get a couple questions over here, please. Jude.
Just a quick comment. It's really my husband's story. He was attending an event at one point, and a congressperson that I could hardly agree with on most of her issues, very conservative woman from Idaho, Helen Chenoweth, I think was her name, decided to do a little performance art around the cool issue. And she had a bag of rawhide bones, and she pulled them out one by one. This one came, it was country of origin label, and this one was from Brazil, and this was from China, and this one came from, all over the world. She said, if my dog can find out where his rawhide bone came from, explain to me in simple language why I can't know where my hamburger comes from. I think we need to resurrect that, performance art sometimes has its value.
Am I to understand that we are, as citizens, we are to be equated with her dog?
Below. Yeah, we're below her dog.
Got it. It must be a very good dog.
I'd like to follow up on that. Oprah asked the same question.
Who did?
Oprah.
Oh, she did, yeah.
And guess who sued her?
Yeah.
NCB.
B-A. That's right.
Yeah.
And
You have to mentally condition the consumer to, it's like Bob Peterson said once, President and CEO of IBP, biggest meat packer in the country at the time. We sell them what they want and deliver them what we got.
Oh.
Chris.
Yeah, first of all, I love my dogs, And I don't feed them junk dog food, I buy them the best. And having said that, getting back to the basics again, and maybe Mike, you can help me out on this. Consumer choice. You mentioned about there's not enough hamburger that they have to import. Okay, from the way down local level, we used to have cattle, but now I buy from a guy. Have my own hogs yet, but when you put in the order for the meat, depending on the individual consumer, sometimes we'll get the roast and a lot of it put into hamburger. Other times it's the other way around. And that's consumer choice. That's not really, this whole system you're talking about is driven by price. They're milking the biggest dollar out of the lowest quality products. And that's why they're doing this. Now, when you get down to the local foods, the locker plants, and maybe the small packing plants, what I'm saying here, this issue can partially be addressed, right, Mike?
It can. If you go to a local locker plant, you're getting the whole animal back. Should be, at least. And you can have that broke down into whatever number of pounds of ground beef that you want. You can have the grounds, the rounds, the chucks ground up. Ground beef it's an awesome product. It's what people really want the most of, and it's easy to fix. It's almost like a convenience food. So it's also a great place to hide stuff. And so when you go to the Walmart grocery store, you're getting a lot of imported stuff. You're getting pink slime that's added to it. There's gas in it. We just, as consumers, really have to become better informed. And we really have to just be more careful about where we buy our food. But the problem really is at the grocery store, there just isn't enough on the label to be able to make the right choice. And so we've got a real problem out there right now with consumers being able to afford to eat. Food prices are not cheap, and so they go for that low price, and as a result, they really are acting so contrary to their own interests, of their community, of their health, of their neighborhoods, and they just don't know it. We have to give them more information. And so one of the things that happened at RCAF a couple weeks ago at their annual meeting in Cheyenne, Wyoming, was a resolution was passed to expand country of origin labeling to all meat at all points of sale. So when you go into a McDonald's, when you go into a Burger King, when you go into any place that sells a plate of food with meat on it, you're entitled to know exactly where that meat came from. So wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah, it goes back to you get what you pay for, but people don't know what they're getting.
That's right, they're being deceived.
I'd like to follow up on that just a little bit. The reason we export the chucks and the rounds is because the foreign market will pay more for that. And they'll import the trims that they can get for next to nothing, because the consumer wants, the American consumer wants hamburger, wants ground beef. Right now they're getting caught because the export market is reaching a point where the foreign countries don't want to pay that much for chucks and rounds. And I had said this for years and years and years to these guys. I said, why don't you just grind those chucks and rounds in the hamburger and stop importing trims?
Exactly.
But your point is exactly correct. They would look at me and say, but we make more money doing that. And I said, who is we? We is them. That's who it is. But I'd like to also address Reed for a second there when he was talking about the money that ranchers are making right now. And I'm going to sound like a griping rancher. In 1979, my dad sold yearling calves, Holstein bucket calves, Holstein Cross, Hereford Cross calves, at Burwell Sale Barn, weighing 900 pounds, and he got $600, $650 a head for it. 12 of those calves in 1979 bought him a brand new four-wheel drive Chevy Silverado, loaded from one end to the other. He would buy a new pickup every 3 years. I am 52 years old and I bought my first new pickup this year. And it was a loaded Dodge and it cost $53,000.
How many cats?
Calves are bringing $1,500 apiece. You do the math. Who's better off? Pasture rent has gone to $400 a pair. My taxes at the ranch are my real estate taxes are 17% of my gross income. The newspaper pays 0.012% of its gross income to real estate taxes. Now, who keeps the school going? Who keeps the community college going? Who keeps the county government going? Who keeps the county roads going? Who keeps the county pantry going? Real estate taxes do. Not income taxes, not sales taxes. All that stuff goes to your state government or to Washington, D.C. Real estate taxes is what runs your local economy, your local government. And it's paid for by the farmers and ranchers.
Let me just say as well, Reed, one of the, and I know you're a cattle producer, Reed, but one of the biggest problems we might have today is for cattle producers to think cattle prices are high. They aren't. They are not high. They aren't even back to we haven't even got back to our share of the consumer beef dollar that we got in 1970.
I did a spreadsheet in 1996, and I was so angry at the price of the way cattle fell. And my grandfather used to look at me and he'd say, "You do not know how tough things are until you've lived through the 30s." So I took average disposable income from 1912 to 1996, put it on a chart, and I put the average price of cattle, put it on a chart, compared them in a ratio. During the 30s, during 35, when it was so bad, it was 13-1. So you had to have 13 head of cattle that you sold to equal the disposable income of the average American. By 96, it was 35-1. In the Depression, when it was so ugly, it really wasn't that bad. Seriously.
Okay, let's get one more question up here.
It's me.
Janine,
It's me. It's me.
oh, I'm sorry?
Isn't it okay? So here's my question. It sounds like you've got some taxation without representation going on. What would happen if all of you didn't pay the beef checkoff? Can you do that?
Well, it's enforceable by law and there's fines that go behind it. They took Jeannie Charter, didn't pay. They drug her to the Supreme Court. What they do is they'll pick one and make an example out of them for everyone.
The Supreme Court ruled that it's a tax.
It is a tax.
You have to pay.
It's government speech.
Yeah,
Which makes it even more unfair.
It's particularly insidious, this thing. There really is no recourse for the independent rancher on this. And I did a white paper, you can look it up on my show's website, about summarizing this issue. And really, beef, the consolidated retailers have used their power to drive down the price of beef. However, if you take a look at how it compares to the cost of living, they've driven down the cost, but they've taken way more than what their share used to be. So they've taken it from the rancher, but they've enriched themselves at twice the cost of living. It's really an astounding number.